Hello and welcome. The day has gone, but the night has only begun. It's time to quiet the mind and soothe the soul. Let these peaceful images and the promise of renewal carry you into a deep and restful sleep. Breathe in and out. Let's begin. Section 1. The Stalemate in the Valley of Elah. The sun beat down upon the Valley of Elah with a relentless, metallic glare. It was a landscape held in a state of perpetual tension, a raw, open wound between two nations. On the northern ridge, the camp of the Philistines sprawled, a bustling, noisy city of leather tents and arrogant banners. On the southern ridge, the army of Israel under King Saul was dug in, a quieter, more apprehensive gathering. Between them lay the flat, dry riverbed, a no-man's land that seemed to breathe with the collective anxiety of both armies. This was not a scene of constant, chaotic battle, but a grinding, psychological siege that had stretched on for 40 days. The air was thick not with the dust of combat, but with the heavy, paralyzing weight of fear. The Israelite camp, in particular, was a place of muted despair. The men, seasoned fighters from the tribes of Benjamin and Judah, were not cowards. They had faced the Philistines in open battle before. But this was different. This was a war of intimidation, and they were losing it badly. Each morning, as the sun crested the eastern hills, a collective dread would settle over them. They knew what was coming. They would don their armor, take up their spears and shields, and form their battle lines, a show of force that felt increasingly like a theatrical performance masking sheer terror. The focus of their fear was a man who defied human scale, Goliath of Gath. He was not merely a tall soldier. He was a living weapon, a spectacle of engineered destruction. His height was recorded as 6 cubits and a span, roughly 9 feet, 9 inches. He was a giant, a descendant of the ancient Anakim, and his very presence was a statement of Philistine superiority. His armor was a masterpiece of Bronze Age military technology. A coat of bronze scales, each one painstakingly hammered and linked, weighed over 125 pounds. Greaves of bronze protected his shins, and a javelin of bronze was slung across his back. The head of his spear alone was made of 15 pounds of forged iron, a metal so superior and costly it made the weapon not just a tool of war, but a symbol of immense wealth and power. He carried a massive shield, not on his arm, but by a shield-bearer who walked before him, making his approach a two-man phalanx of impending doom. And then the sound would come, the deep, resonant thud of his footsteps as he descended from the Philistine line into the valley floor. It was a sound that echoed in the chests of every Israelite soldier. He would stop, plant his feet wide, and his voice would erupt, a roar that needed no amplification to carry across the distance. Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. The challenge was a classic one: single combat, the fate of two armies, two nations, resting on the outcome of a duel between their two champions. It was a way to avoid the bloody, costly mess of a full-scale battle. In theory, it was efficient and honorable. In practice, for Israel, it was a daily ritual of humiliation. Goliath's voice would ring out, laced with contempt. I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man, that we may fight together. The words were not just a challenge. They were a curse, stripping the Israelite army of its collective identity and reducing it to a frightened, leaderless mob. And the most damning part of the entire spectacle was the silence that followed. The silence from the Israelite ranks. King Saul, the tallest and most kingly man in Israel, a head taller than any of his subjects, said nothing. He did not step forward. The great generals, Abner and the other mighty men of valor, said nothing. They looked at their feet. They adjusted their grips on their spears. They found the shapes of clouds suddenly fascinating. The champion of Israel was absent. There was no one who could stand against this mountain of bronze and iron. The promise of the Lord, that he would fight for them, seemed a distant, theoretical concept in the face of such tangible, roaring opposition. The faith of an entire army was crumbling, day by day, under the weight of a single man's voice. The standoff was complete, a perfect equilibrium of terror, entirely engineered by the Philistines and accepted, through inaction, by the people of God. They were trapped, not by enemy spears, but by their own fear. Section 2. The Anointed Shepherd in a King's Camp. The journey from the quiet, rolling hills of Bethlehem to the tense, militarized ridge in the valley of Elah was a journey between two different worlds. For Jesse's youngest son, David, it was a mission born of simple, familial duty, but it would place him at the epicenter of a national crisis. He was not a soldier. His hands were calloused from the wood of a staff and the strings of a lyre, not the haft of a spear. His muscles were tuned for chasing stray lambs and fighting off predators, not for facing a trained warrior in phalanx formation. His skin was tanned by the sun of the pasture, not the harsh glare of a battlefield. He was an errand boy, sent by his father, Jesse, to bring provisions to his three oldest brothers, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah, who served in Saul's army, and to bring back a report of their well-being. The 10 loaves of bread, the 10 cheeses, and the parched grain were heavy in his pack, but the weight of the atmosphere he entered was far heavier. He arrived at the Israelite camp just as the morning ritual of dread was unfolding. The soldiers were forming their battle line, shouting their war cry, a sound that to David's keen ears seemed to lack conviction, to be more a performance of bravery than its genuine expression. He left his supplies with the keeper of the baggage and ran quickly to the ranks, seeking out his brothers, his heart likely pounding with a mix of excitement and curiosity. This was the army of the living God. He expected to see resolve, holy anger, a fervent trust in the Lord of hosts. What he found was paralysis. Just as he greeted his brothers, the familiar, terrifying routine began. The giant, Goliath, emerged from the Philistine lines and shouted his defiant challenge. David saw the entire Israelite army not surge forward in righteous indignation, but shrink back. He saw men's faces pale. He saw them whispering to one another, their eyes wide with fear. He heard them saying, "Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel." This reaction was a profound shock to David's system. He operated from an entirely different worldview. To him, the issue was not the size of the warrior, but the insult he was leveling. The man was not defying a random army. He was defying the armies of the living God. For David, this was a theological issue, a direct affront to the honor and power of the covenant God of Israel. The fear of the soldiers was a practical, human response. David's indignation was a spiritual one. He began asking questions, his voice cutting through the murmur of fear. What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? His questions were not those of a mercenary seeking a reward. They were the questions of a zealot, bewildered that such a challenge could go unanswered. The repetition of the phrase uncircumcised Philistine is key. To David, Goliath's physical stature and weaponry were irrelevant details next to his spiritual status. He was outside the covenant, unredeemed, and therefore, despite all his apparent power, he was fundamentally vulnerable before the God of Israel. David's perspective reframed the entire conflict. It was not a battle of strength versus strength, but of blasphemy versus faith. His eldest brother, Eliab, overheard him and burned with anger. Eliab represented the voice of the establishment, the voice of shamed pride. "Why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle." Eliab's attack was personal and dismissive. He accused David of negligence and a reckless, arrogant heart. He sought to put the young shepherd back in his place, to reassert the hierarchy of age and military experience. But David's calling and anointing had already placed him on a different path. He simply turned away from Eliab and continued asking his questions of others. his resolve hardening in the face of his brother's scorn and the army's collective cowardice. The shepherd boy, anointed by the prophet Samuel to be the future king, was now the only person in the entire camp viewing the situation with the clarity of faith. Section 3. The theology of a slingshot. David's audacious proposal. Word of the brash, questioning youth quickly circulated through the camp, a ripple of something other than fear. It was a novelty. When it reached King Saul, holed up in his tent, besieged by his own inadequacy and terror, he was intrigued enough to summon the boy. David stood before the king, not in the polished armor of a courtier, but in the simple, dust-stained tunic of a shepherd. He was not a part of the military system that had failed so completely. He was an outsider, and that was his greatest strength. Saul, the king who stood head and shoulders above every other man in Israel, looked down at this ruddy-faced youth. He saw no soldier. He saw a boy, and David's words, when he spoke, must have seemed like madness born of ignorance. Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. It was a statement of breathtaking audacity. The entire professional army, including the king himself, was paralyzed with fear, and this shepherd boy who had just arrived was volunteering to be the champion. Saul's response was dripping with the logic of the world, the very logic that had imprisoned them all. You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth. Saul's assessment was, from a purely human and military standpoint, undeniably correct. It was a mismatch of catastrophic proportions. Goliath was a veteran, a career soldier trained from childhood in the art of killing. David was a child, a shepherd. It was like pitting a battle-hardened special forces operative against a teenage farmhand. The outcome was a foregone conclusion, but David understood that this was not a contest that would be decided by human metrics. He did not argue his own qualifications as a warrior. Instead, he presented his resume as a shepherd, a protector. This was the core of his theology, the foundation of his faith. Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, David explained, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. In this powerful speech, David laid out his entire strategic and spiritual framework. First, he established his experience with life and death conflict. The lion and the bear were not theoretical dangers. They were powerful, savage predators that he had personally killed with his hands and a club. He had proven his courage and his skill not on a parade ground, but in the authentic high-stakes arena of the wilderness. Second, and most importantly, he attributed his success not to his own strength, but to divine intervention. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. This was the pivotal difference. Saul and his army saw Goliath and thought, he is too big to kill. David saw Goliath and thought, he is too big to miss. More importantly, he saw the battle as the Lord's. David reframed the enemy. Goliath was not an invincible super soldier. He was just another predator, no different in the eyes of God from a lion or a bear, and he had defied not just Israel, but Israel's God. This made him, in David's eyes, already defeated. The battle was not David versus Goliath. It was the Lord of hosts versus an uncircumcised blasphemer, and David was merely the instrument through which God would enact his judgment. This unshakable conviction, this transfer of agency from himself to God, was the secret weapon that no one else in the camp possessed. Saul, perhaps moved by a desperate hope or the sheer force of David's faith, finally relented. Go, he said, and the Lord be with you. The king's blessing was given, but it was clear that the faith behind the venture belonged entirely to the young shepherd. Section 4. The armor of the world and the weapons of faith. With the king's reluctant permission granted, the practical matter of equipping the champion arose. Saul, still thinking in conventional terms, insisted that David be dressed in the king's own armor. It was a gesture meant to help, born of a worldly understanding of warfare. The royal armor was brought out, a coat of mail, likely of bronze scales, a heavy bronze helmet, and a sword girded to the side. For a moment, the shepherd boy was transformed into the image of a king, clad in the regalia of earthly power and military might. David put it on. He moved in it. He took a few steps, the metal plates grinding against each other. The weight was immense, unfamiliar, and restrictive. This was not his way. The armor, designed for a man of Saul's stature and for the static, close-quarters combat of the infantry line, was a prison on David's smaller, more agile frame. He had never trained in such equipment. His fighting style, developed in the open fields, relied on speed, mobility, and precision, not on absorbing blows and trading them in a shoving match. The very thing that was supposed to protect him would have been his downfall. It would have made him slow, clumsy, and predictable, an easy target for the massive, if also slow, Goliath. He made a decision of profound symbolic and practical importance. He took it all off. "I cannot go with these," he said to Saul, "for I have not tested them." He rejected the armor of the king, the armor of the world system, the armor of conventional wisdom. He chose instead to go into battle with the tools he knew, the tools God had already proven in the fires of real, personal crisis. This act was a powerful declaration. Victory would not come by mimicking the world's methods, but by trusting in the efficacy of the gifts and the training God had already provided in the secret place, in the wilderness. He went down to the wadi, the seasonal stream that ran through the valley, and he did something that must have seemed absurd to the watching armies. He didn't select a spear or a sword. He bent down and carefully chose 5 smooth stones from the stream. The smoothness was important. Irregular stones would fly unpredictably. These were perfect aerodynamic projectiles, shaped by the water's flow over time. He placed them in his shepherd's bag, a pouch that normally carried food or supplies for the flock. Then, with his staff in one hand and his sling in the other, he began to walk out into the no-man's land toward the Philistine champion. The image was one of stark, almost laughable contrast. From the Philistine side emerged Goliath, a mountain of bronze and iron, a walking fortress, his shield-bearer marching before him. From the Israelite side came a single, unarmored youth, carrying a stick and a leather sling. To Goliath and his comrades, it was an insult. To the Israelites, it must have looked like a suicide mission. But David was not unarmed. The sling was not a child's toy. In the ancient world, it was a deadly, long-range weapon. Slingers were a standard part of many armies, capable of hurling stones at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour, with enough force to crack skulls and break bones. David was a master of this weapon, a skill honed over countless hours in the solitude of the fields, protecting his sheep from afar. His weapons were not the symbols of royal power, but the humble, effective, and God-tested tools of a faithful shepherd. He was not going out to brawl with the giant. He was going out to demonstrate the power of God with the precision of a skilled marksman. Section 5. The confrontation, a clash of worldviews on the battlefield. As David approached, Goliath finally got a clear look at his opponent. The giant's initial reaction was not anger, but deep, profound contempt. He felt insulted. He had called for the champion of Israel, and they had sent a boy, a handsome, ruddy-faced youth, whose only weapons were a staff and a sling. Goliath's response was to disdain David. He cursed him by his gods, a common practice before combat to invoke divine disfavor upon one's enemy. "Am I a dog?" he roared, "that you come to me with sticks?" The word sticks is plural, likely referring to both David's staff and the sling, which to Goliath looked like just another stick. The giant's worldview was one of sheer physical dominance. He saw only what was visible, his own immense size and weaponry versus David's apparent weakness. He then leveled a terrifying, psychological threat. "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field." It was a promise of total annihilation and desecration, a common tactic to instill fear. This was the voice of the world, the voice of the bully, the voice that says might makes right, that the biggest and the strongest always win. It was a voice that, for 40 days, had held an entire army in thrall. But David did not cower. He did not respond in kind with curses. He answered with a declaration of faith that stands as one of the most powerful speeches in all of literature. He shouted back, his voice carrying across the valley, not with the deep bass of the giant, but with the piercing clarity of conviction. You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. With these words, David redefined the terms of the battle for everyone present. He acknowledged Goliath's weapons, the sword, spear, and javelin, but he dismissed them as irrelevant. His own power was not in a sling, but in the name, the authority, and the manifest presence of the Lord of hosts, the commander of heaven's armies. He was not representing himself or even just the army of Israel. He was representing the God whom Goliath had publicly mocked. The conflict was now on a spiritual plane. He continued, prophesying the outcome. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth. Notice the reversal. Goliath threatened to give David's flesh to the birds. David declared that not only Goliath, but the entire Philistine army would become carrion. His confidence was absolute because it was rooted in a divine guarantee. He was merely the agent of a judgment that had already been decreed in the heavenly courts. He concluded with the ultimate purpose of the confrontation. That all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. This was the theological climax. The point was not national pride, not personal glory, not even the reward from Saul. The point was the revelation of God's character and power to the whole world. It was a missionary statement, and the method of victory would be a lesson for all time. Salvation, deliverance, does not come through human weaponry, sword and spear, but through the sovereign intervention of God. The battle was the Lord's. David was just the willing, faithful instrument. With the verbal exchange complete, the stage was set for the physical act that would confirm this stunning declaration of faith. Section 6. The stone that found its mark. Mechanics of a miracle. The air in the valley of Elah grew thick and silent, holding its breath. The two figures were now close enough to see the whites of each other's eyes. Goliath, encased in his hundredweight of bronze, began his advance. It was not a run, but a deliberate, ground-shaking trudge, a force of nature moving with grim, inevitable purpose. His shield-bearer walked a few paces ahead, a mobile wall designed to deflect any initial, futile projectiles before Goliath moved in for the kill with his massive spear and sword. This was the perfected doctrine of Philistine heavy infantry, and it had never before been challenged by a lone, unarmored man. David did not stand his ground. He did not prepare for a defensive, last-stand melee. Instead, he did the unexpected. He ran. He ran toward the battle. But his run was not a blind, furious charge. It was a tactical, purposeful sprint, a movement of agility and speed designed to close the distance on his own terms while simultaneously presenting a difficult, moving target. As he ran, his right hand moved with a fluid, practiced motion that was second nature to him. He reached into his shepherd's bag and felt for one of the 5 smooth stones. His fingers, calloused from years of guiding sheep and practicing his sling, selected one perfect missile. The sling itself was a deceptively simple weapon. 2 long cords of leather or sinew with a central pouch to hold the stone. In the hands of an expert, it was a fearsome tool of war. The slinger would whirl the sling in a rapid, horizontal or vertical orbit above his head, building up immense centrifugal force. The key was not arm strength, but timing, rhythm, and release. The entire system acted as a lever, multiplying the force applied to the stone, allowing it to be launched at a velocity that could exceed that of an arrow. David's mind, in these critical seconds, was likely a study in focused calm. This was not the first time he had faced a lethal threat. The muscle memory of confronting the lion and the bear took over. His world narrowed to the rhythm of the whirling sling, the calculation of distance, and the small, vulnerable gap in Goliath's formidable armor. The giant, confident and contemptuous, would have left his face exposed. The helmet had eye holes, but the forehead, the temple, the bridge of the nose, these were potential targets. Goliath, seeing no sword or spear in David's hand, would have felt no immediate threat. The boy with the sling was a nuisance, not a danger. He may have even lowered his guard slightly or laughed, a fatal misjudgment of the weapon and the faith behind it. The release was a matter of millimeters. One cord was let go at the precise moment in the arc of the spin, sending the smooth stone flying not in a lob, but a deadly, flat, and accurate trajectory. There was no twang of a bowstring, only a faint whirring sound and the crack of supersonic speed. The stone, a piece of the very valley they stood in, became a divinely guided projectile. It flew true, crossing the short distance in a fraction of a second before Goliath could react or his shield-bearer could interpose. It struck the giant with a sickening, definitive thud. The text states it sank into his forehead. This was not a glancing blow. The force of the impact was tremendous. The stone, moving at a speed too fast to see, would have transferred its kinetic energy directly into Goliath's skull, causing immediate and catastrophic trauma. The giant's brain would have shut down in an instant. His nervous system ceased to function. The towering, defiant, terror-inspiring champion of the Philistines stumbled. His legs buckled beneath the immense weight of his own armor. He crashed face forward onto the stony ground of the valley, a fallen colossus. The sound of his armor and body hitting the earth was a thunderclap that echoed more profoundly than his voice ever had. The miracle was not just that David was accurate. It was that the stone had the stopping power to instantly neutralize a being of such size and strength. It was a victory of precision over power, of faith over flesh, and it happened in the space of a single breathtaking moment. Section 7. The silence and the roar, a paradigm shattered. For a long, suspended moment, there was absolute silence on both sides of the valley. The Israelite army and the Philistine host were united in a shared, stunned disbelief. The sequence of events had been too rapid, too contrary to all expectation and logic, to be immediately processed. The visual narrative they had all accepted for 40 days, the invincibility of Goliath, had just been violently rewritten before their eyes. The Philistines watched as their champion, their ultimate weapon, their psychological shield, fell. The sight was not just a defeat, it was an impossibility. It was a crack in the foundation of their reality. Their gods, Dagon and Baal, whom Goliath had invoked, had been publicly shamed. Their military doctrine, centered on the dominance of their heavy infantry, had been rendered absurd by a shepherd's sling. The fear that had once gripped the Israelites now transferred to them in a sudden, chilling wave. If their champion could be so easily dispatched, what hope did the common soldier have against a God who fought in this manner? On the Israeli side, the silence was one of shock giving way to a dawning, explosive realization. For 40 days they had been conditioned to fear. They had internalized their own inferiority. They had seen no way out. The fall of Goliath was not just the death of a man. It was the death of the spirit of fear that had held them captive. The giant, in that moment, became smaller in their minds than the God they had forgotten was on their side. The silence broke. A roar began to build, starting as a collective gasp and surging into a triumphant, guttural shout of victory and release. It was the sound of a nation rediscovering its identity as the people of the living God. In the center of this paradigm shift stood David. He did not pause to celebrate. The giant was down but not yet dead. The job was not finished. With the Philistine army still watching, paralyzed by horror, David ran again. This time, he ran to the prostrate form of Goliath. He stood over the fallen giant, a small figure looming over a mountain of metal. He had no sword of his own, but Goliath carried one. David put his foot on the giant's neck, a powerful symbol of total subjugation, and grasped the hilt of Goliath's own massive sword. He drew it from its sheath. It was a heavy, cumbersome weapon, designed for a hand far larger than his, but in that moment, it was the instrument of final justice. With a single, powerful stroke, he used the Philistine's own weapon to sever the giant's head. He lifted the head by the hair, a grisly but undeniable trophy. The message was clear and brutal. The the defiance was over. The reproach was removed. The head of the blasphemer was a physical proof of the victory God had wrought. This act was the final, crushing blow to Philistine morale. Seeing their champion not only dead but beheaded, the spell was completely broken. Their confidence shattered into 1,000 pieces, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. The Israelites, seeing David holding the head aloft, felt their roar intensify. The tide of the entire campaign had turned on a single smooth stone and the unwavering faith of one young man who believed his God was bigger than any giant. Section 8. The rout when God fights, armies flee. The sight of their champion's head held high in the hand of the young Hebrew shepherd was the catalyst for a total psychological collapse within the Philistine army. The carefully maintained discipline of their ranks dissolved in an instant. The event was not merely a military setback. It was a theological cataclysm. Their gods had been proven powerless before the God of Israel. The very foundation of their courage, the presence of Goliath, was now not only absent but had become a symbol of their own humiliation and impending doom. A wave of panic, contagious and unstoppable, swept through the Philistine camp. The cry of every man for himself would have been unspoken but universally felt. The soldiers turned from a professional fighting force into a terrified mob. They dropped their shields, their spears, anything that would slow their flight. Their only thought was survival. The line of battle disintegrated as they fled back toward their own territory, the path to Gath and Ekron. The order of their advance was replaced by the chaos of their retreat. This was the moment King Saul and the army of Israel had been waiting for, though they had long since ceased to believe it would come. The victory of their champion in single combat meant, by the rules of that engagement, that the Philistines were now their servants. But the Philistines were not honoring the deal. They were breaking and running. Saul, shaking off the stupor of 40 days, saw the opportunity. He shouted the order to pursue. The Israelite army, moments before paralyzed by fear, was now infused with a furious, divinely inspired energy. The same men who had shrunk back from Goliath now charged down the slopes of the valley of Elah with a triumphant roar, their fear transformed into unstoppable fervor. The pursuit was relentless. The Israelites chased the Philistines along the road to their coastal cities, harrying them all the way to the gates of Gath and Ekron. The wounded of the Philistines fell along the way, and the bodies of the slain littered the route from Sharaim, a town on the border, all the way to the very thresholds of their home cities. The victory was total. The Israelite army, which had been trapped and demoralized, now plundered the abandoned Philistine camp, taking the wealth, supplies, and weapons left behind in the frantic retreat. This rout was the direct and logical consequence of David's faith. His victory was not a personal achievement to be celebrated in isolation. It was a national deliverance. By trusting God to handle the one thing no one else could, Goliath, he unlocked the potential of the entire army. He demonstrated that when one person operates in genuine faith, it creates a ripple effect that empowers an entire community. The soldiers who had been too afraid to fight found their courage not by looking within themselves, but by witnessing the power of God working through David. The battle was the Lord's, and the rout was its inevitable outcome. The Philistines weren't just running from the Israelite army. They were fleeing from the manifested presence of a God they had foolishly defied. Section 9. The aftermath ahead, a question, and the seeds of future strife. The dust of the rout began to settle in the valley of Elah. The sounds of battle were replaced by the sounds of victory. The cheers of Israelite soldiers, the clatter of collecting spoils, and the shared stories of the miraculous day. In the midst of this national triumph, a more intimate and politically charged scene was unfolding. King Saul, his kingdom suddenly and dramatically secured, watched as the young hero returned from the pursuit. David, likely still clutching the giant's sword and carrying the severed head of Goliath, approached the king. Saul's general, Abner, the commander of his army, brought the young man before him. The text introduces a poignant and almost jarring note. And Saul said to him, "Whose son are you, young man?" This question is layered with profound meaning. Saul had spoken with David before the battle. David had volunteered in his presence. Yet, in the aftermath, Saul seems not to know who he is. Some scholars suggest that in the heat and chaos of the moment, and given the emotional state Saul was likely in, he simply forgot. Others see a more strategic political calculation. David's answer is humble and direct. I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. He does not claim glory for himself. He identifies himself through his father, a man of no great tribal standing. He is not a prince, not a noble, just the son of a farmer from Judah. In this moment, the two kingdoms, the failing one and the future one, stood face to face. Saul saw a deliverer, but he would soon see a rival. The narrative follows David as he took the head of Goliath to Jerusalem, a Jebusite stronghold at the time, perhaps as a grim trophy to be displayed on the border as a warning to Israel's enemies. He also stored the giant's armor in his own tent. Meanwhile, a new dynamic was being born in the courts of Israel. As David was speaking with Saul, another person was witnessing the scene, and the event was etching itself onto her heart and into her destiny. She was Michal, the daughter of King Saul. The text will later reveal that she loved David. This personal affection would soon become a political tool for her father. But the most immediate and public consequence of the victory was the song. As the army returned home, women from all the cities of Israel came out to meet King Saul, singing and dancing with joy and musical instruments. Their song was simple, celebratory, and utterly devastating to the king's psyche. Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. The song was not meant as an insult to Saul. It was a Hebrew poetic parallelism, a way of saying, we've had great victories, but this one is the greatest. But in Saul's ears, it was a direct and mortal threat. The praise he had once craved now felt like a poison. He had been upstaged. The spirit of fear that had left the army now took up a new residence in the heart of the king. They have ascribed to David 10,000s, he raged. And to me they have ascribed thousands, and what more can he have but the kingdom? The very faith that had saved Saul's kingdom began to plant the seeds of a bitter, murderous jealousy that would define the rest of his reign. The giant was dead on the outside, but a new one was being born in the heart of the king. Section 10. The anatomy of a giant Goliath as more than a man. To view Goliath merely as a historical figure, a very large Philistine soldier, is to miss the profound symbolic weight he carries within the biblical narrative and in the human experience. He is an archetype, a manifestation of every form of opposition that stands against the purpose and people of God. Understanding the anatomy of this giant is key to understanding the nature of the victory David achieved. First, Goliath was a symbol of covenantal opposition. He was, as David repeatedly emphasized, an uncircumcised Philistine. This was not a mere ethnic slur. It was a theological classification. Circumcision was the outward sign of God's covenant with Abraham. It set Israel apart as God's chosen people. Goliath stood outside of that covenant, unredeemed, and in active rebellion against the God who established it. His challenge was not just against an army, but against the covenant itself. He represented the world system, the kingdom of darkness, arrayed against the kingdom of light. Second, he was the embodiment of humanism and military power. His confidence was rooted entirely in the visible and the tangible. His physical stature, his superior technology, iron weapons versus bronze, and his proven prowess as a warrior. He represents the idea that the biggest army, the most advanced technology, the greatest human intelligence, and the most forceful will are the ultimate determinants of victory. He is the ultimate self-made man, trusting in his own strength and mocking the idea of divine intervention. His worldview had no room for a God who works through the weak to confound the strong. Third, Goliath was a master of psychological warfare. His strategy was not to engage in immediate battle, but to demoralize and paralyze his enemy through intimidation. The 40-day ritual was a carefully crafted campaign of terror. He used his size, his voice, and the spectacle of his armor to create an atmosphere of hopelessness. He made the Israelites feel small, weak, and abandoned by their God before a single spear was thrown. He represents the giants of fear, anxiety, and despair that shout their lies at us daily, convincing us of our inadequacy and God's absence. Fourth, he was a spiritual stronghold. The Apostle Paul, centuries later, would describe the Christians' battle not against flesh and blood, but against spiritual forces of evil. Ephesians 6 verse 12. Goliath was the physical manifestation of such a force. His power over the Israelite army was spiritual before it was physical. He held them in bondage through a spirit of fear. Defeating him required not just martial skill, but spiritual authority. The authority that comes from operating in the name of the Lord of hosts. Finally, Goliath represents the seemingly insurmountable problem. For every person reading the story, Goliath can be whatever massive looming challenge threatens to overwhelm them. A devastating diagnosis, a financial collapse, a broken relationship, a crippling addiction, an impossible workplace demand. He is the problem that seems too big to solve, the obstacle that seems too high to climb, the voice that says, "You will fail." The story of David and Goliath is given to us to deconstruct this very perception. It teaches us that the size of the giant is irrelevant next to the size of our God. The victory was not won by matching the giant's strength, but by countering it with a different kind of power altogether. The power of faith, obedience, and trust in a sovereign God who specializes in impossible odds. David did not see a giant too big to kill. He saw a target too big to miss and a God too big to fail. Section 11. The unseen preparation from pasture to palace. The victory in the valley of Elah appeared, to the watching world, as a sudden, explosive event. A single stone, a single moment, a single act of faith. But this perception belies the profound and meticulous preparation that preceded it. David's triumph was not an accident of fate. It was the culmination of a long, hidden process of character formation and skill development, orchestrated by the hand of God in the obscurity of the Bethlehem pasturelands. His years as a shepherd were not a waste of time or a menial prelude to his real life. They were the essential training ground for his destiny. Consider the solitude. For days, weeks, and months on end, David was alone with the sheep on the Judean hills. In that silence, away from the noise of society and the expectations of his family, he developed an inner life of immense depth. It was in this solitude that he learned to listen, not just to the bleating of sheep or the whisper of the wind, but to the voice of God. The Psalms he would later write are filled with imagery from this period. The Lord is my shepherd. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. These are not the abstract musings of a theologian, but the hard-won convictions of a man who had experienced God's faithful presence in the lonely, dangerous wilderness. This deep, personal relationship with Yahweh was the bedrock of his faith. When he faced Goliath, he was not operating on second-hand religion. He was standing on the solid foundation of a faith he had personally built and tested in the secret place. His responsibilities, though humble, forged in him an unshakable character. As a shepherd, he was tasked with the constant, vigilant care of creatures that were defenseless, prone to wander, and entirely dependent on him. This thankless job cultivated patience, compassion, and a profound sense of responsibility. He had to be faithful in the small things, finding water and pasture, binding up the injured lamb, keeping careful count of the flock at night. This faithfulness in obscurity was the very quality God would later look for when appointing him king over Israel. The shepherd's heart he developed for his sheep would become the king's heart he would need for his people. When he saw the army of Israel as helpless sheep without a shepherd in the face of Goliath, his instinct to protect was not political calculation. It was the ingrained reflex of a true shepherd. Furthermore, his skills were honed through daily necessity. The sling was not a weapon he picked up for the first time to fight the giant. It was an extension of his own hand, a tool he had used thousands of times to guide the flock by landing a stone near a straying sheep, or to defend them from predators. His confrontation with the lion and the bear was not a legendary story he fabricated for Saul. It was the terrifying reality of his profession. In those life-or-death struggles, he learned to face fear, to rely on his agility and courage, and, most importantly, to experience firsthand the divine intervention he would later proclaim. He didn't just believe God could deliver. He knew it because God already had. His resume was written not on parchment, but in the scars and memories of the field. The unseen preparation in the pasture was what made the public victory in the valley possible. God was building a man, and he used the loneliness, the mundane tasks, and the hidden dangers of shepherding as his primary tools. Section 12. The weapon of a prophet: David's rejection of Saul's armor. The moment David removed King Saul's armor stands as one of the most symbolically rich actions in the entire biblical narrative. It was far more than a practical decision about military equipment. It was a prophetic act that delineated a fundamental shift in how God's people were to achieve victory. Saul's armor represented the world's system of power, a system of external, human-centric strength that had already proven spiritually bankrupt. David's rejection of it was a declaration that the battle ahead would be fought on an entirely different plane, with entirely different weapons. Saul's armor was the best the world had to offer. It was royal, state-of-the-art, and designed for the king himself. It represented human authority, political power, and conventional military strategy. To the watching army, it must have seemed like the only logical choice. How could a mere boy face a giant without the best possible protection? Yet, when David put it on, he was immobilized. He tried in vain to go. The armor, designed for a man of Saul's stature and for a specific type of close-quarters combat, was ill-suited for David's body and God's strategy. It was a system he had not tested. This is a crucial spiritual principle. We cannot win spiritual victories using worldly methods that we have not internalized and made our own through personal experience and faith. Borrowed armor, second-hand faith, and untested theology will always leave us clumsy and ineffective. By stripping off the bronze helmet and coat of mail, David was making himself more vulnerable in the eyes of the world, but more available to God. He was choosing agility over armor, mobility over mass, and faith over force. He was not going to out-Philistine the Philistine. He was not going to meet brute force with a slightly lesser version of brute force. His power would not be in his ability to absorb a blow, but in his ability, through God's grace, to avoid the blow altogether and strike with precision. His chosen weapons, the staff, the sling, the stones, were the tools of his profession. They were the instruments God had already anointed and proven in the hidden battles of his life. He was not coming as a soldier, but as a shepherd, not as a king's proxy, but as God's prophet warrior, armed with the tested weapons of his calling. This act prefigures the words of the Apostle Paul centuries later. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh but have divine power to destroy strongholds. 2 Corinthians 10 verse 4. David intuitively understood this. The true stronghold was not Goliath's physical body, but the spirit of fear and defiance he had erected over the Israelite army. That stronghold could not be dismantled with a sword or a spear, only with the divine power that flows through faith and obedience. David's sling was a physical weapon, but in that moment, it became a spiritual one. It was the conduit for his faith. His rejection of the world's armor was a powerful testament that the battle was the Lord's, and victory would be achieved not by conforming to the world's methods, but by being transformed through the renewing of one's mind and the trusting of one's God-given identity. Section 13. The power of a spoken testimony: David's words as a weapon. Before a single stone was loaded into his sling, David had already begun to fight Goliath with a weapon far more potent than any piece of Philistine iron: his spoken testimony. His dialogue with Saul and his shouted declaration to the giant were not mere pre-battle banter. They were strategic, faith-filled proclamations that shaped the spiritual reality of the battlefield. David understood the creative and declarative power of words, using them to frame the conflict, to state God's promise, and to prophesy the outcome, thereby actively participating in bringing that outcome to pass. When David stood before King Saul, he did not merely volunteer. He bore witness. He recounted his personal history of God's deliverance. "Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God." In doing this, he was doing several things simultaneously. First, he was building his own faith by rehearsing God's past faithfulness. Remembering what God has done in the past is the surest foundation for believing what he will do in the future. Second, he was educating Saul, shifting the king's perspective from the problem, the giant's size, to the solution, God's power. He was reframing Goliath from an invincible super soldier to a mere predator, no different from the wild animals he had already overcome. This testimony was a weapon that began to dismantle the stronghold of fear in the command tent. Then, on the battlefield itself, his words became a direct spiritual confrontation. Goliath cursed David by his gods, invoking the power of Dagon and Baal. David responded by invoking the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel. This was not just a name, it was a claim of authority. The Lord, Yahweh, was the covenant-keeping, personal God of Israel. The Lord of hosts, Yahweh Sabaoth, was the commander of all the heavenly armies, the angelic forces of heaven. David was declaring that this was not a contest between two men, but a cosmic battle between the powerless gods of the Philistines and the all-powerful creator of the universe. He was pulling back the curtain on the physical realm to reveal the spiritual war happening underneath. His subsequent prophecy, "This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel," was a breathtaking act of faith. He was not hoping for a positive outcome. He was stating a divinely assured fact. He was speaking the end from the beginning. By declaring the victory aloud, he was aligning himself with God's will and creating a spiritual pathway for that will to be manifested in the physical realm. His words were a container for his faith, and when released, they set in motion the very events they described. The stone was the physical fulfillment of the spiritual reality his words had already established. Before Goliath fell from the stone, he had already been felled by the truth declared in the name of the Lord. Section 14. The Psychology of the 40 Days, the Anatomy of Fear. The 40-day standoff in the Valley of Elah was not a passive waiting game. It was an intense, psychological siege where the real weapon was fear. To understand the magnitude of David's victory, one must first dissect the anatomy of the fear that held the Israelite army captive. This fear was not a simple emotion. It was a complex, self-reinforcing system of intimidation, isolation, and eroded faith that systematically dismantled the army's will to fight. The first component was repetition and ritual. Goliath's challenge was not a one-time event. It was a daily ritual performed at the same time in the same way for 40 consecutive days. The human psyche is profoundly affected by repetition. A threat heard once can be dismissed or rationalized. A threat heard every single morning becomes a grinding, inescapable reality. The soldiers woke up each day knowing exactly what was coming, their dread building from the moment they opened their eyes. This ritualization of intimidation created a conditioned response of helplessness. They were not just afraid of Goliath, they were trapped in the process of being afraid. The second component was public humiliation. Goliath's taunts were not whispered. They were roared across the valley for all to hear. He called them servants of Saul, questioning their very identity as free people. He labeled them as cowards by the sheer fact of their silence. This public shaming had a corrosive effect. Individually, a soldier might have mustered some courage, but collectively, the shared experience of humiliation created a group mentality of powerlessness. No one wanted to be the one to fail in front of everyone, to be the one whose death would confirm Goliath's taunts. The fear of public failure became as potent as the fear of death itself. The third and most critical component was spiritual assault. Goliath was defying not just an army, but the armies of the living God. His challenge was a direct attack on their theology. With each passing day that God did not strike Goliath down or raise up a champion, the Israelites' faith in their God eroded. They began to wonder, had God abandoned them? Was he not powerful enough? Was their covenant meaningless? The giant's voice became louder in their minds than the silent promises of God. Their fear was, at its root, a theological crisis. They had forgotten the stories of Yahweh fighting for them at the Red Sea and at Jericho. The present threat had blinded them to past deliverances. This 40-day conditioning created a state of learned helplessness. The army, and even King Saul, had subconsciously accepted their defeat. They were no longer looking for a way to win. They were merely enduring, hoping the problem would somehow go away. Into this psychologically devastated environment stepped David. He was effective precisely because he had not been subjected to the 40 days of conditioning. He arrived with a fresh perspective, an untainted faith, and a memory of God's power that was more immediate and real to him than the giant's roar. He broke the cycle of fear because he operated from a different reality, the reality of God's faithfulness, a reality that fear could not touch. Section 15. The aftermath in Gath, the giant's head as a divine message. While the Israelite army pursued the fleeing Philistines and plundered their camp, David performed a deliberate and symbolic act that carried a profound theological and political message. The text states that he took the head of Goliath and brought it to Jerusalem, but he also stored the giant's armor in his own tent. However, an earlier passage in 1 Samuel notes that Goliath's sword was later kept in the tabernacle at Nob, and it was this very sword that David would later take when he fled from Saul. The journey of Goliath's possessions, and particularly his head, is a story in itself, speaking of victory, testimony, and the ultimate shame of God's enemies. The most immediate destination for the head was likely a public display. Jerusalem was at that time a Jebusite stronghold, not yet conquered by Israel. However, it was a prominent and contested location on the border between Israelite and Philistine territory. To place the head of Goliath there, perhaps on a stake or pike visible from afar, was a powerful, unmistakable declaration. It was a billboard of victory for every Israelite who saw it, a permanent reminder that their God was victorious. For every Philistine or Canaanite who saw it, it was a terrifying warning. It signaled that the balance of power had shifted. The champion they had relied upon was not only dead but disgraced, his body mutilated and put on display according to the brutal customs of ancient warfare. This was the ultimate fulfillment of Goliath's own threat. He had promised to give David's flesh to the birds, but instead, his own head became a monument to his defeat. The armor, stored in David's tent, became a personal trophy of God's grace and a tangible reminder of the calling placed upon his life. But its significance was more than personal. In the ancient world, the armor of a defeated champion was often dedicated to the victor's God. By placing Goliath's sword in the tabernacle at Nob, David was performing a supreme act of worship. He was acknowledging that the victory did not belong to him, but to the Lord. The weapon of the blasphemer was transformed into a sacred relic, a perpetual testimony within the house of God of the day he delivered Israel through the hand of his servant. It stood as physical evidence for future generations of priests and worshippers that Yahweh is a God who saves. The aftermath in Gath, Goliath's hometown, must have been one of profound mourning and terror. The return of the routed army, without their champion, would have sent shockwaves through the city. The news that his head was displayed on the border and his sword was in the temple of the Hebrew God was the final crushing blow. The message to Gath and all of Philistia was clear: your power is broken, your gods are shamed, and our God reigns. The giant's head was more than a grisly trophy. It was a prophetic sign. It signaled the beginning of the end of Philistine dominance and the rise of a new power in Israel, a power rooted not in human strength but in radical dependence on the Lord of hosts. The victory was not just for a day, but for a generation, and its testimony echoed from David's tent to the house of God and to the borders of the enemy's land. Section 16. The echo in the court, Saul's jealousy and the shifting of favor. The triumphant songs of the women. Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s, did not fade away with the dust of the battlefield. Instead, they echoed through the courts of Gibeah, finding a permanent and corrosive residence in the soul of King Saul. This moment marks a critical pivot in the narrative, where national victory sows the seeds of personal tragedy, and the spirit of fear, defeated in the valley, finds a new host in the palace. The aftermath of the giant's fall reveals a giant rising within the king himself. Saul's initial response to David had been one of grateful affection. He took David into his royal household, appointing him over the men of war and elevating him to a position of high command. Jonathan, Saul's son and the crown prince, bound himself to David in a covenant of profound friendship, loving him as his own soul. For a time, David served Saul faithfully, prospering in all his undertakings. He was the hero of the hour, the tangible evidence of God's favor upon Israel. Yet, The very evidence of this divine favor became the source of Saul's torment. The women's song, meant to celebrate, became a curse in his ears. The Hebrew poetic structure was a standard form of praise, but Saul heard not parallelism, but comparison. He heard not celebration, but demotion. What more can he have but the kingdom? This single, paranoid thought, born from a deep-seated insecurity about his own rejected kingship, festered into a malignant obsession. The very next day, a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul. This biblical language describes God's sovereign permission, allowing the consequences of Saul's own disobedience and pride to manifest in his mental and emotional state. As David played the lyre to soothe him, Saul hurled a spear, intending to pin David to the wall. This was not a momentary lapse of judgment. It was the unmasking of a heart now fully given over to jealousy and fear. The weapon meant to protect the kingdom was now wielded to destroy the kingdom's true protector. In this violent act, Saul demonstrated that he was now more aligned with the spirit of Goliath, the spirit of destructive, self-preserving force, than with the spirit of God. He sought to eliminate the perceived threat to his power, just as Goliath had sought to eliminate the threat to Philistine power. This event reveals the tragic anatomy of jealousy. Saul's sin was not merely in his angry reaction, but in the distorted perception that preceded it. He saw God's blessing on another as a personal loss for himself. He interpreted David's anointing as the diminishment of his own. He failed to understand that the favor on David's life was for the salvation of the very kingdom Saul was supposed to be leading. His jealousy blinded him to the truth that a rising tide lifts all boats, and that David's success was Israel's success. Instead of fostering the gift God had sent him, he sought to kill it. The echo of the women's song in his court became the death knell for his own dynasty, as he actively began to work against the very deliverance God was providing. Section 17. The Covenant of Kindred Spirits, Jonathan and David. In stark contrast to the darkening jealousy of King Saul, the narrative presents one of the most luminous portraits of friendship in all of literature. The covenant between Jonathan and David. Immediately after David's conversation with Saul following the Goliath incident, even before any official position is granted, Jonathan's soul is knit to the soul of David. This powerful verb suggests a divine weaving together, an instantaneous and profound connection that transcended political calculation, social hierarchy, or personal gain. In the midst of a story dominated by conflict and fear, their relationship stands as a testament to loyalty, selflessness, and a shared faith in the God of Israel. Jonathan, the crown prince, had every human reason to see David as a threat. The same songs that provoked Saul's jealousy were, in effect, singing David's praises above Jonathan's own father. In the ruthless world of ancient monarchy, potential rivals to the throne were often eliminated. Yet Jonathan exhibited a breathtaking lack of personal ambition and a profound spiritual discernment. He recognized the hand of God upon David. Instead of feeling threatened, he felt a deep kinship. Their bond was forged in the fires of shared faith. Jonathan himself was a man of great courage and faith, having earlier attacked a Philistine garrison trusting in God, 1 Samuel 14. He saw in David a kindred spirit, a fellow warrior for the Lord of hosts. Their friendship was not based on convenience or amusement, but on a shared commitment to God's purposes for their nation. The formal expression of this friendship was a covenant. Jonathan, the prince, made a covenant with David, the shepherd. This was a legally and spiritually binding agreement of mutual loyalty and protection. In a stunning act of symbolic abdication, Jonathan stripped himself of the royal robes that represented his claim to the throne and gave them to David, along with his armor, his sword, his bow, and his belt. This was not a mere gift of clothing. It was a profound, prophetic act. Jonathan was publicly and voluntarily transferring the rights and symbols of kingship to the man he knew was God's anointed. He was prioritizing God's will over his own birthright, a level of humility and faith almost unparalleled in Scripture. This covenant would be tested in the most severe ways imaginable as Saul's persecution of David intensified. Jonathan repeatedly acted as an intermediary, defending David before his father at great personal risk. He chose loyalty to his friend and to God's anointed over obedience to his own paranoid father. Their friendship became a sanctuary for David, a source of emotional strength and strategic intelligence during his years as a fugitive. The story of Jonathan and David demonstrates that even in the midst of the most intense spiritual and political battles, God provides allies, kindred spirits who will stand with us, protect us, and help us fulfill our destiny. Their covenant was a divinely ordained anchor of stability in the turbulent seas of Saul's reign. Section 18. The Weapon in the Temple, the Legacy of Goliath's Sword. The narrative of David and Goliath contains a fascinating and poignant subplot involving the giant's own sword. After David killed Goliath, he took the giant's weapons and stored them in his tent. However, 1 Samuel 21 later reveals that Goliath's sword was not merely a war trophy kept in a private collection. It was placed in the tabernacle at Nob, the central place of worship, wrapped in a cloth behind the sacred ephod. This journey of the sword from the hand of a blaspheming giant to the house of the god he defied is rich with theological symbolism and narrative irony. By placing the sword in the tabernacle, David was performing a supreme act of worship and testimony. In the ancient Near East, it was customary to dedicate the spoils of war to one's deity as a tangible acknowledgement of divine help in battle. David was following this tradition, but with profound significance. The very instrument of the enemy's power, the symbol of Philistine defiance and military might, was transformed into a sacred offering. It was no longer a weapon of rebellion but a monument to God's victory. It stood behind the ephod, the garment used to discern God's will, as a permanent reminder that Yahweh's guidance and power were superior to the finest weapons of the enemy. Every priest who served at Nob would see that sword and remember the day God delivered Israel not by an army, but through faith. The irony of the sword's location reaches its peak years later when David, now a fugitive from Saul, arrives at Nob alone and desperate. He lies to Ahimelech the priest, claiming to be on a secret royal mission, and asks for a weapon. Ahimelech responds, "Behold, the sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, is here, wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you will take that, take it, for there is none but that here." In this moment of utter vulnerability, hunted by the king he once saved, David is handed the very sword he used to decapitate his first great enemy. The weapon he had dedicated to God was now given back to him by God's priest for his survival. The symbolism is breathtaking. The victory of the past becomes the provision for the present. The faith David exhibited in his youth was now sustaining him in his adulthood. The enemy's weapon, consecrated to God, was now available for God's anointed in his time of need. As David took the sword, he must have felt the profound circularity of God's providence. He wasn't just holding a piece of metal, he was holding a testament to God's faithfulness. The God who delivered him from the Philistine giant was the same God who would deliver him from the royal giant now seeking his life. Goliath's sword, once a symbol of terror, became first a symbol of victory, then a symbol of God's enduring, provisionary care for his anointed through every season of life. Section 19. The shadow of the giant Goliath's family and unfinished business. The defeat of Goliath was a decisive blow, but it did not instantly erase the Philistine threat. The spirit of defiance he embodied lived on, and the narrative later reveals that the giant of Gath had a family, a lineage of warriors who carried his legacy of size and hostility toward Israel. This shadow of the giant reminds us that victories, while decisive, often do not eliminate all future conflict. Rather, they equip us and define the terms of the battles to come. The book of 2 Samuel introduces us to other descendants of the giants in Gath. Most notably, 2 Samuel 21 describes 4 Philistine warriors who were descendants of Rapha, the same term used for Goliath. Among them was a man named Lami, who is explicitly called the brother of Goliath the Gittite. Another was a giant with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. These were not merely foot soldiers. They were champions in their own right, continuing the genetic and military tradition of their infamous kinsmen. Their existence shows that the problem represented by Goliath was systemic, not isolated. The victory in the Valley of Elah was a turning point, but the war against the Philistine giants, continued into David's kingship. The most dramatic encounter with this legacy involved not David, but one of his own mighty men, Elhanan. The text records that Elhanan the son of Jeroham, the Bethlehemite, killed Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. This verse has caused much discussion, as it seems to conflict with the account of David's victory. Many scholars propose that this is a scribal error or that it refers to another giant with the same name, perhaps a relative. Others suggest it means Elhanan killed Goliath's brother, Lami, in a subsequent battle. Regardless of the precise historical resolution, the theological point is clear. The spirit of Goliath was a recurring enemy that had to be confronted by multiple faithful warriors across a generation. These later battles, fought by David's men, demonstrate that the faith David modeled was transferable. He was not the only one who could bring down a giant. His leadership and his own act of faith created a culture of courage and dependence on God that empowered others to achieve similar feats. The shadow of Goliath loomed long, but it was met by the growing shadow of a kingdom led by a man after God's own heart. The unfinished business with Goliath's family was ultimately resolved not by one man in one day, but by a community of faith, forged in the example of their king, who continued to fight the battles of the Lord, trusting in the same God who gave David victory in the valley. Section 20. The archetype of Christ David as a forerunner. For Christian readers of the Old Testament, the story of David and Goliath transcends its historical and moral dimensions to become a powerful Christological archetype. David, the anointed king and deliverer of Israel, functions as a type or foreshadowing of Jesus Christ, the ultimate anointed one and deliverer of humanity. The parallels between David's victory and Christ's work of salvation are deep and structurally significant, revealing a consistent pattern in God's redemptive plan. First, both David and Jesus are rejected and overlooked choices. When Samuel came to anoint a king from Jesse's sons, David was the last considered, the youngest, out tending the sheep. Similarly, Jesus came from the insignificant town of Nazareth and was despised and rejected by men. His own people did not receive him. The Messiah was not the political or military champion they were looking for, just as David was not the obvious choice for champion against Goliath. Second, both act as substitute champions who fight on behalf of their people. Israel was under a curse of fear and slavery to the Philistines, unable to save themselves. David, as their representative, fought Goliath in their place. His victory was counted as their victory. In a far greater sense, humanity was under the curse of sin and death, unable to save itself. Jesus Christ, as the representative and substitute for all who would believe in him, fought and defeated the ultimate giants of sin, death, and Satan on the cross. His victory is counted as our victory. Third, the weapons of their warfare are parallel. David rejected the conventional armor of Saul and fought with the weapons of faith and the word of God's promise. He triumphed through apparent weakness, a sling and a stone. Similarly, Jesus did not conquer through legions of angels or political power, but through the apparent weakness of the cross, through sacrifice, love, and obedience. The weapon of the gospel seems foolish to the world, but it is the power of God for salvation. Fourth, the outcome of their victory brings liberation and plunder. David's victory freed Israel from immediate terror and allowed them to plunder the Philistine camp. Jesus' victory on the cross frees believers from the power of sin and death, and we share in the plunder of his grace, eternal life, and spiritual blessings. The head of Goliath, displayed publicly, is a picture of Christ's victory over Satan, a public spectacle of triumph, Colossians 2 verse 15. Finally, both secure a covenant and a kingdom. David's victory paved the way for his kingship and the establishment of his royal line. Jesus' victory established the new covenant and secured an eternal kingdom for all who are in him. David is the shepherd king who prefigures the good shepherd and the king of kings. In this light, the story of David and Goliath is not just a tale of ancient bravery. It is a preview of the gospel, a dramatic enactment of the great truth that our God specializes in saving his people through the seemingly weak, the unexpected, and the faithful, ultimately culminating in the person and work of Jesus Christ. Section 21. The geological and geographical stage, the Valley of Elah as a character. The story of David and Goliath is not merely a drama of personalities. It is a narrative deeply rooted in a specific and significant physical landscape. The Valley of Elah, the stage for this epical confrontation, is more than a passive backdrop. It functions as a silent, strategic character in the story, its very geology and geography shaping the tactics, the psychology, and the ultimate outcome of the event. To understand the battle is to understand the ground upon which it was fought, a terrain that offered both a challenge and a divine provision hidden in plain sight. The valley itself, a wide, flat basin carved by the seasonal Nahal Elah, the brook Elah, sits as a natural borderland between the low-lying Philistine plain and the rising foothills of the Judean Shephelah. This location was a classic invasion route, and its choice by the Philistines was a masterstroke of military intimidation. By pitching their camp on the northern rise at Ephsdammim, they positioned themselves as an aggressive force looking down upon the Israelites, who were encamped on the southern rise. The open valley floor between them, the arena for the daily challenge, was a perfect killing field for a heavy infantry champion like Goliath. It was flat, unobstructed, and offered no cover, allowing his full physical stature and the terrifying spectacle of his advance to be visible to all, maximizing the psychological impact on the Israelite forces. Every morning, the Israelite soldiers would look down from their own ridge into this vast, open space and see their doom waiting for them, the geography itself amplifying their sense of exposure and vulnerability. The most critical geological feature, however, was not the vastness of the valley floor, but the modest seasonal stream that meandered through its center, the brook Elah. This wadi, dry for much of the year except during the winter rains, was the source of David's chosen ammunition. Its bed was a repository of smooth, rounded stones, worn to perfection by the relentless flow of water over centuries. These were not rough, jagged rocks from the hillsides. They were ideal projectiles for a sling, their aerodynamic shape ensuring a stable and accurate flight. This was a divine provision embedded in the very geology of the battlefield. While Goliath relied on the forged, artificial power of his iron and bronze, David utilized a natural, God-given resource. The valley itself provided the means for its own deliverance. The contrast is profound. The Philistine power was imported, manufactured, and external. The Israelite power was native, God-created, and drawn directly from the land of the covenant itself. David, in picking up those 5 smooth stones, was not merely gathering weapons. He was tapping into a foundational source of strength, a symbol that the very creation itself was on the side of God's people when they fought in faith. Furthermore, the geography dictated the tactics. Goliath, weighing hundreds of pounds with his armor, was built for slow, crushing, close-quarters combat on level ground. The valley floor suited him perfectly. David, unarmored and agile, needed to use the space differently. His run toward Goliath was a tactic of agility versus mass. The open ground, while seemingly an advantage for Goliath, also provided David with a clear line of sight and a long, unobstructed field of fire for his sling. He could maneuver and launch his projectile without the interference of trees or rough terrain that might disrupt his shot or Goliath's charge. The geography, which at first appeared to favor the giant, contained within it the very conditions for his downfall when confronted by an adversary who understood how to use it in an unconventional way. The Valley of Elah, therefore, stands as a testament to the fact that God prepares the battlefield long before the warrior arrives. The stage was set not just with opposing armies, but with a built-in advantage for the one who would fight by faith, seeing the resources provided by God in the landscape that everyone else saw only as a place of terror and defeat. The stones in the brook were a silent promise, waiting for the hand of faith to pick them up and use them for God's glory. Section 22. The sling in ancient warfare, reassessing David's chosen weapon. The common perception of David's sling often diminishes it to the status of a child's toy or a simple shepherd's tool, making his victory seem all the more miraculously improbable. However, a historical reassessment of the sling in ancient warfare reveals a different reality. David was wielding a professionally recognized, devastatingly effective, and sophisticated long-range weapon. Understanding the sling's true capabilities not only demystifies the mechanics of the victory, but also deepens our appreciation for David's skill and the tactical genius of his choice. reframing the event from a purely supernatural suspension of physics to a divine orchestration that worked through and enhanced human skill and available technology. The sling was, in fact, one of the most common and feared projectile weapons of the ancient world, used by armies from the Assyrians and Egyptians to the Greeks and Romans. Slingers often fought as specialized units alongside archers and spearmen, valued for their ability to outrange archers and hurl projectiles with bone-shattering force. The typical sling consisted of 2 cords of leather or sinew, often woven from animal hair or flax for strength, with a wider pouch in the center to hold the projectile. Its power came not from the strength of the arm, but from the centrifugal force generated by whirling it in a wide arc overhead or to the side, effectively acting as a lever to multiply the thrower's force exponentially. A skilled slinger could launch a stone or lead gland, a cast lead projectile, at speeds estimated to exceed 100 miles per hour, with an effective range of over 400 meters, significantly outstripping the range of most contemporary bows. The impact force of such a projectile has been compared to that of a modern .45 caliber handgun. Historical accounts from writers like Thucydides and Xenophon describe sling bullets penetrating armor and cracking skulls. The Roman army, known for its military pragmatism, extensively employed slingers for their ability to harass and break up enemy formations before the main infantry engagement. The stones themselves were not random rocks. They were carefully selected for size, weight, and smoothness, or in the case of lead glands, cast in molds for perfect aerodynamics and often inscribed with taunts or the names of military units, turning them into early forms of psychological warfare. In this light, David was not bringing a pea shooter to a cannon fight. He was bringing a precision, long-range rifle to a duel with a slow-moving, heavily armored tank. His choice was not one of desperation, but of tactical intelligence. David's specific expertise with this weapon cannot be overstated. While Philistine and Israelite soldiers trained with sword and spear, David had spent countless solitary hours in the wilderness mastering the sling. His was not the basic competence of a soldier trained in multiple weapons. It was the consummate skill of a specialist. His accuracy would have been honed to an incredible degree, capable of hitting small, moving targets like the heads of predators threatening his sheep. He understood the windage, the trajectory, and the release point instinctively. When he faced Goliath, he was not performing a lucky shot. He was executing a practiced maneuver against a large, slow-moving target. The giant's most vulnerable point, his forehead, was a clear and viable target for a slinger of David's caliber. The true miracle, therefore, was not that a stone from a sling could fell a man, but that God orchestrated events to place a master slinger, armed with unshakable faith, in a position to use his divinely honed skill at the precise moment of national crisis. The victory was a synthesis of divine sovereignty and human responsibility, of supernatural faith and natural skill perfectly aligned. David didn't need Saul's sword. He was already armed with a weapon whose deadly potential the entire army had foolishly underestimated, demonstrating that God's deliverance often comes through the faithful mastery of the seemingly humble gifts he has given us. Section 23. The Philistine Pantheon, the spiritual forces behind Goliath's defiance. When Goliath strode into the valley of Elah and roared his challenges, he was not acting as an individual mercenary or a lone braggart. He was the champion and representative of the Philistine nation, and behind him stood the full weight of their religious and spiritual worldview, a pantheon of gods that stood in direct opposition to Yahweh, the God of Israel. To fully grasp the spiritual dimensions of this conflict, one must understand the nature of these Philistine deities and how Goliath's defiance was, in essence, a theological proposition, that the gods of the Philistines were more powerful than the God of the Hebrews. The primary god of the Philistine pantheon was Dagon, a fertility deity often depicted as half-man, half-fish, symbolizing the Philistines' connection to the sea and their dependence on agricultural bounty. Dagon was considered the father of the god Baal, a powerful storm and warrior god. The Philistines, having migrated from the Aegean world, the captor of Amos 9 verse 7, likely syncretized their own maritime gods with the Canaanite deities of the land they conquered, creating a hybrid pantheon centered on power, fertility, and martial success. The history between Yahweh and Dagon was already fraught with tension. In 1 Samuel 5, after the Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant, they placed it in the Temple of Dagon in Ashdod as a war trophy, a symbolic act declaring Dagon's superiority. The next morning, the statue of Dagon was found fallen on its face before the Arkansas. After setting it back up, they found it the following morning not only fallen again, but with its head and hands broken off. This was a humiliating and decisive spiritual defeat, demonstrating Yahweh's absolute supremacy over the impotent idol. Goliath's challenge, therefore, can be seen as a Philistine attempt to overturn this earlier spiritual humiliation on the battlefield. He was, in a sense, Dagon's champion seeking revenge. When he cursed David by his gods, he was invoking the collective power of Dagon, Baal, and the rest of the Philistine pantheon, attempting to enact a curse that would render David vulnerable and ensure his own victory. This was a standard practice in ancient warfare, where battles were seen as contests between national gods. David's response is a masterclass in spiritual warfare. He does not engage in a tit-for-tat cursing match. Instead, he immediately identifies and names the core issue. Goliath is an uncircumcised Philistine. This term, repeated for emphasis, cuts to the heart of the matter. Circumcision was the sign of the Abrahamic covenant, the mark of being set apart as God's people. By using this label, David was declaring that Goliath stood outside of God's promises, unprotected and unblessed. More importantly, David reframes the entire conflict not as my God versus your gods, but as a direct assault on the armies of the living God. The term living God, Elohim Chayim, is a direct rebuttal to the lifeless, man-made idols of the Philistines. Dagon was a statue of wood and stone that could not see, hear, or act. Yahweh was a living, breathing, active, and powerful being. David was asserting that the battle was not between two sets of supernatural beings, but between a dead, man-made system and the one true creator God. His victory would not be a narrow win for one tribal deity, but a public demonstration that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. The fall of Goliath was, therefore, the second and final humiliation of Dagon, proving once and for all that the God of Israel was the Lord of hosts, the one who commanded both the armies of heaven and the simple faith of a shepherd boy to accomplish his purposes. Section 24. The psychological metamorphosis of an army from fear to faith. The 40-day standoff in the Valley of Elah was a masterclass in psychological warfare that systematically broke the spirit of the Israelite army. Goliath's daily ritual was not just a challenge. It was a conditioning process designed to instill a collective state of learned helplessness. The soldiers transition from this paralysis to becoming a ferocious, pursuing force after David's victory represents one of the most dramatic psychological metamorphoses in military history, a shift orchestrated not by a change in their own numbers or equipment, but by the introduction of a single catalytic agent, embodied faith. The initial state of the army was one of profound cognitive dissonance. They were the army of the living God, the recipients of the promises to Abraham, the people for whom God had parted the Red Sea. Yet, their present reality was one of abject terror and shame. This dissonance was resolved not by bolstering their faith, but by suppressing it. To avoid the mental anguish of believing in a powerful God who seemed to be doing nothing, they simply accepted their powerlessness. Their theology became theoretical, disconnected from the tangible threat in the valley below. This is the anatomy of a faith crisis, where present circumstances shout down historical testimony and spiritual identity. David's arrival acted as the disruptive catalyst that shattered this psychological stalemate. He was an external variable, untouched by the 40 days of conditioning. He operated from a different cognitive framework, one where the historical testimony of God's power, his past deliverances from lions and bears, was more real than the present threat. When he voiced this framework aloud, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God?" He was not just asking a question. He was reintroducing a suppressed truth into the collective consciousness of the army. His words were a cognitive key, unlocking a door they had sealed shut out of fear. He then modeled this faith through action. His willingness to fight, his rejection of conventional armor, and his calm walk into the valley were a powerful behavioral demonstration that made abstract faith tangible and observable. The army, which had no model for how to respond to Goliath except with fear, now had a living, breathing model of how to respond with faith. The moment the stone struck its mark, the collective psychology of the army underwent an instantaneous and violent transformation. The core of their fear, the perceived invincibility of Goliath, was shattered. The cognitive dissonance resolved itself not toward despair, but toward belief. The God they had thought was absent was, in fact, powerfully present. The faith that David had individually embodied was now transferred to the collective. It was a psychological contagion of courage. The same men who had trembled in their tents now found a surge of divinely inspired fury. Their flight response transformed into a fight response. The pursuit of the Philistines was not just a military tactic. It was a psychological release, a cathartic outpouring of 40 days of pent-up fear, now converted into aggressive energy. The metamorphosis was complete. They were no longer a paralyzed mob defined by their fear of a giant, but a victorious army defined by their faith in a giant-slaying God. David's victory did not just kill a man. It resurrected the soul of an army. Section 25, The Legacy in Art, Literature, and Culture, the David and Goliath Archetype. The story of David and Goliath has transcended its biblical origins to become one of the most enduring and ubiquitous archetypes in human culture, a universal shorthand for the underdog triumphing against overwhelming odds. Its themes are so fundamental to the human experience that it has been endlessly adapted, referenced, and reinterpreted in art, literature, politics, and sports for over 2 millennia. Tracing this legacy reveals how the narrative's core elements, the small versus the large, faith versus force, the unconventional versus the traditional, resonate across time and context, speaking to a deep-seated human yearning for the seemingly powerless to overcome the seemingly invincible. In the world of art, the subject has been a cornerstone of Western canon, inspiring masterpieces from the Renaissance to the Baroque. Donatello's bronze David, c. 1440s, presents a youthful, almost effeminate boy standing contemplatively over Goliath's head, a symbol of Florentine Republican virtue triumphing over tyrannical force. Michelangelo's colossal marble sculpture, 1501 to 1504, captures the moment before the battle, a perfect fusion of classical beauty and intense psychological tension, representing the ideal of human potential poised for action. Gian Lorenzo Bernini's David, 1623 to 1624, breaks from the static pose, capturing the biblical hero in mid-motion, his body coiled in dynamic effort, representing the Baroque era's love for drama and emotional intensity. Each artist projected their own cultural and philosophical concerns onto the story, using it to explore themes of civic duty, humanist ideals, and spiritual struggle. In literature and popular culture, the David and Goliath motif has become a foundational plot structure. It is the template for countless stories where a humble hero uses wits and courage to defeat a monstrous foe, from the fairy tale of Jack and the Beanstalk to the epic struggle of the hobbits against Sauron in J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. In modern cinema, films like Rocky, Star Wars, The Rebel Alliance versus the Empire, and The Hunger Games all draw power from this archetype. In the realm of politics and history, the narrative is frequently invoked to frame conflicts. The American colonists were portrayed as David against the Goliath of the British Empire. In the 20th century, small nations resisting superpowers or dissidents standing up to totalitarian regimes have consistently been framed in David and Goliath terms. The narrative provides a powerful moral and rhetorical framework that casts the struggle not just as a conflict of power, but as a conflict of right against might. In business and sports, the metaphor is equally pervasive. Startup companies challenging industry giants, underdog teams winning championships against all odds. These are all celebrated as David and Goliath stories. The archetype taps into a fundamental human desire to believe that preparation, skill, heart, and sometimes a little ingenuity, the sling as a disruptive technology or a new strategy, can level the playing field. However, the cultural adoption of the story often secularizes it, focusing on the underdog theme while stripping away the core theological message. The world celebrates the slaying of the giant, but often forgets that the power to do so came from the name of the Lord of Hosts. The cultural legacy of David and Goliath, therefore, stands as a testament to the story's profound power, but also as a cautionary tale about how its deepest truth, that true victory comes not from human effort alone, but from faith in a sovereign God, can be the first thing lost in translation. Yet, even in its diluted form, the archetype continues to inspire hope that the small can be mighty, that the weak can confound the strong, and that no giant is ever as invincible as it appears.